Today, Abby and Andrea will be talking about World War II and the effects on the United States. Hello, Andrea and Abby.
Hello.
I have 6 questions for you two. Can you tell me why many Americans supported isolationism? Why did Roosevelt support internationalism? What kind of sacrifices does the war require? What roles did minorities and women play in the armed forces during this time period? How did the U.S. government mobilize the economy for war? And finally, how did Americans support the war at home?
No problem. The U.S. did not pick sides but supported its allies. Congress passed the Neutrality Act in 1935 because they were worried that growing German and Italian aggression might lead to war. With the situation in Europe getting worse, Congress passed a second Neutrality Act in 1937. This is important because the U.S. did not want to be a part of the war but still maintain the Allied relationship.
Public opinion was hardly unanimous. The spring of 1940, a spirited debate took place between people who wanted greater American improvement in World War II and those who felt that the United States should remain neutral. The opinion of the public is important because they are part of the country and should have a say in what happens.
Roosevelt supported internationalism, which was the idea that trade between nations creates prosperity and helps to prevent war. The internationalists believed the U.S. should try to preserve peace in the world. Roosevelt knew that the public wanted neutrality. He warned that the Neutrality Act might drag us into war instead of keeping us out. This is important because Roosevelt had the idea that the United States would not be involved in the war, but people did not listen to him.
Roosevelt came up with a way to remove the cash requirement of the Neutrality Act. With the Lendlease Act, the U.S. would be able to lend or lease arms to any country considered vital to the defense of the U.S. By the time the program ended, the United States had contributed more than $40 million in weapons, vehicles, and other supplies to all the Allied war efforts. This is important because the U.S. helped its ally and possibly would receive support in the future.
These attacked Pearl Harbor, which was what brought the United States into World War II. Roosevelt did not want the Japanese to attack the British Empire, so Roosevelt put economic pressure on them. Japan was furious and signed an alliance with Germany and Italy. Japan attacked the Pearl Harbor, killing more than 2,400 Americans on December 7, 1941. This is important because the United States had no idea that Hawaii was a possible target.
Military. Within days of Germany's attack on Poland, Roosevelt expanded the army to 227,000 soldiers. During World War II, people built less cars and more tanks. After Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt tried to improve the system by creating the War Production Board, where it clashed to create more materials for the war. The importance of this is that the production of war materials was the way to defeat the enemies.
African Americans did not support the war. African Americans were disfranchised, meaning they were denied their right to vote. In order for the African Americans to be in the war, they launched a campaign called Double V, which was a victory over Hitler's racism abroad and Americans' racism at home. As a result, Roosevelt told the military to recruit African Americans and put them into combat. Women joined the armed forces by being assigned administrative and clerical jobs. In May 1942, women were put in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. It was not part of the regular army. A year later, women were transferred to the Women's Army Corps. Women were later part of the Coast Guard, the Navy, and the Marines. Thusly, another 68,000 women served as nurses in the Army and the Navy. This is important because both African Americans and women were granted more rights, but still limited.
As mentioned before, tanks replaced cars. Automobile factories began to produce trucks, jeeps, and tanks. They did not only produce vehicles, but they also built artillery, rifles, mines, helmets, pontoon bridges, cooking pots, and dozens of military equipment. By the end of the war, the factory had built over 8,600 aircraft. Women had clerical jobs, but what captured the public's imagination the most was women in the factories. Eventually, 2.5 million women went to work in shipyards, aircraft factories, and other manufacturing plants. This is important because their success permanently changed America's attitudes about women in the workplace. During World War II, African Americans migrated to the crowded cities of the North and West. African Americans experienced critical racial violence in Detroit. Gang fights began between white and African girls erupted. By the time the violence ended, 25 African Americans and 9 whites were dead. This shows that racism wasn't over during this time.
Back on Pearl Harbor, Americans turned their anger to the Japanese living in the U.S. Japanese were first forced out of their homes and were put in internment camps. During World War II, the U.S. government and many Americans viewed German Americans as potentially dangerous. This is important because Americans were afraid of Japanese and Germans.
We have sacrifices and support. Parents sacrifice their sons, children sacrifice their fathers. Families in the U.S. could only buy so much food. People were recycling metal to get melted, and they also volunteered. This is important because life was a matter of accepted sacrifice, and it was only accepted in the name of patriotism.
So what we learned today was that during World War II, people had to give up things. People were afraid of the Germans and the Japanese. They were put in internment camps, and etc. Well, I think that's all for today. Thank you for being here.